everybody. My name is Dr. Naheed Ahmad, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about unconscious bias. You know, we working in a retail environment or a corporate environment, we actually see some of the most diverse type of population compared to almost any other practice modality in the US. And so it's important that we have an idea of some of these biases that we have. I'm not talking racism. I'm literally just talking a bias. This is my financial disclosure slide. Essentially, I really have no other financial disclosures other than the fact that I am a KOL and a speaker for Allergan and AbbVie. So what am I hoping that we're going to be able to do with this lecture? Categorizing people, as well as almost everything else in the world, is actually natural to us. We do it without even thinking. And what I'm hoping, we can recognize some of these biases and how they might be a barrier to us taking care of our patients the way we want them to. And of course, if we can discover what these biases are, I want to be able to give you tools to kind of deal with them so that we can give the best patient experience to our patients. So let's define what a bias is. A bias is a learned assumption. It's a belief or an attitude. And whether we realize it or not, bias affects our daily personal as well as our professional lives. Bias is not necessarily racism, because a lot of people will say that to me. Bias is a tendency to lean in a certain direction, either in favor of or against something. So if you are biased towards something, you lean favorably towards that thing. If you are biased against something, you lean negatively towards that thing, or you think poorly of it. So in my case, my positive bias is my granddaughter. In my mind, she can absolutely do no wrong. Of course, she's a year old, so she still has some time, but nobody could convince me of anything else. On the other hand, I'm really not fond of broccoli, and I know that's not popular, but I don't like the consistency, so I'm a little biased against it. Please don't tell me messages about how I should prepare it, because I've tried all of them. Now, if you are truly biased, like I am towards my granddaughter, I don't have a neutral viewpoint, and I realize that. On the other hand, if you're truly unbiased, you have really you're completely neutral. You don't really care plus or minus. You don't really have an opinion. So let's talk about the two different types of biases that we have. We have explicit biases and we have implicit biases. The explicit biases, they're conscious. We're aware of them. And we know that they're happening. For example, I can consciously, voluntarily tell you that I think my granddaughter's amazing. And I can tell you that I don't really like broccoli. But the implicit biases, those are the unconscious biases, and those are the ones that we're a little bit more concerned about, because they happen automatically. They happen without us having to think about it, and they happen because of the way that our brain is actually hardwired. Why do we have these? They're mental shortcuts. If we didn't have this, can you imagine the time it would take us to process millions of pieces of information per second in order to do anything? We would pretty much stay where we are. We wouldn't be able to do anything. We'd be frozen. So our brain has to do this. It has to automatically make some associations and some categorizations. And when you look at the unconscious biases, the implicit biases, they tend to be reflexive, so we're not thinking about them. They tend to be ubiquitous, they tend to be automatic, and they tend to be unconscious, so we're not aware of them. Now, brain science can actually tell us a little bit about the two systems. Understanding how associations and patterns and behavior or beliefs, how do they develop? The interesting thing is that system number one is 95%, and that's our unconscious, that's our instinctive, our intuition. Whereas system number two, that's the rational part of us, and it's only 5%. And it's slow, it takes some effort, you have to be conscious about it. On the other hand, when you look at the other system, it's fast, it's automatic, and it comes from unconscious associations and beliefs. And it governs over 95% of what our behaviors are, of what we do. And so that's a pretty big amount for that to be controlling. Now, We all have biases. I've already told you a couple of my biases, but that is something that is ubiquitous. It allows us to navigate our world. It's those mental shortcuts. A lot of these attitudes and beliefs, they're learned at a really, really early age. And where do they come from? They come from our family. They come from messaging, whether it's from society or news or marketing or social media. And kids are like sponges. They're going to soak it all in. And so, you know, these messages, and they can change with time. So these messages are important that we know what these messages are. So for example, the messaging around beauty has changed, and it's different from culture to culture, and it changes from time to time, where one thing that was acceptable 30 years ago and was considered attractive, like the huge bouffant permed hair, which I will admittedly and shamedly tell you that I did have that, to now where that's really not considered as attractive. Aging, you know, a man is considered a gray fox as he's aging, and a woman is just considered old as she's aging. And so these are things that are attitudes that we're learning, they're beliefs that we're learning, but at the same time, they're allowing us to kind of navigate our world. So to put it in really simple terms, it's easier when we're able to put people, places, things, religions, thoughts in a box. Essentially, we're categorizing everything. But when those are interrupted or disturbed, we experience cognitive dissonance. And that is a mental discomfort that we experience when we have to process through something that just doesn't fit in with our beliefs or our thought process, or it's a conflicting idea. So let's talk about cognitive dissonance. One way to either actually show this is the STROOP test. And I'm sure a few of you have done this before. Now, the STROOP test requires that you name the color, not the word, you name the color. Now, if you do the list that's on the left-hand side, that's really easy. I mean, red, green, blue, yellow, green. The control is easy because there's no words to read. You're only looking at colors. Try to do the one on the right-hand side. Now, the tendency is to just say the word. So I want to say blue, but it's actually green, red, blue, yellow, blue, green. I actually had to stop and think about it because the color is not matching up with what the word is saying. So that is what we call, that's the cognitive dissonance that we're talking about. Now, with children who are of a pre-reading age, they actually do perfectly fine with this. They have no trouble because, of course, they can't read the yellow. They're going to just look at it on the right-hand side and go, yeah, that's a red line. So there's really nothing there. And what that tells us is that a lot of what we do is an example of our time, our experiences, influence, our brain development. So it shows up on this type of test. Now, let's look at this. This is when I did the STROOP test and I was timing myself. On the left-hand side, it was really easy. It was not a big deal at all. I mean, just read through all the colors, and because the colors match the word, no problem. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, it was the same thing that I just described. So instead of reading yellow, red, yellow, blue, I need to say blue, brown, red, I want to say green, but it's purple. So it makes it a lot more difficult. And it took about 2.5, almost 3 times longer to do it when they didn't match compared to when they did match. And why is that? Because it takes extra processing. I had to stop to think about it. But that increases our frustration, increases our fatigue, our inattentiveness, and it decreases your motivation. It decreases your cooperation. So you're like, I don't want to do this. And I got halfway through that right-hand side and I'm like, I want to stop. Because it was, I had to literally stop to think about what I was doing. So, you know, implicit and unconscious biases, they reflect a number of things. They reflect human nature, which is your fight, flight, or freeze response, as well as the socialization that we have. It controls, it lives deep within our brains and it governs almost everything that we do. If we can develop an understanding of how strong and how powerful these implicit biases are, we might be able to then develop practices to try to minimize that. So we want to decrease our unconscious tendencies to categorize, generalize, stereotype, or discriminate against people. I'm not talking about positive biases. I'm talking about those negative biases that we might need to deal with. So CE World Magazine came out with the top 40 most common unconscious biases. And you notice that, I mean, yes, racism is part of this, but bias, and especially unconscious bias, is not a singular concept, you know, and I'm going to go into some of that with more detail. But I want to kind of come down to like the third one on your left-hand side, the bandwagon effect. It's also called the conformity bias. There was a study done in 1950s by Solomon Ash. And what he had done is he had taken students and put them in a room and had 3 lines, like literally just drew 3 lines and said, which is the smallest, or which is the medium, or which is the largest. And if the person was by themselves, the subject was by themselves, they had no trouble with it. If the subject was with other people, it became a little bit more difficult. And in fact, if there were more than 5 people in the room, 5, 10, 20, however many people in the room, and they went before the subject, keeping in mind they're all cohorts, they're all in on this, they all chose the wrong one. So if he said, I want you to choose the largest one, they then chose the middle one. And the subject, 75% of the time, would actually go ahead and choose that one. And so that's where these biases, they live deep within us. And why did they do that? Because they thought there was something that they weren't realizing. They thought that if everybody else chose that, then I'm wrong, they must be right. Or I know they're wrong, but I don't want to stand out. I don't want them to make fun of me, so I'm not going to say anything. And conformity also increases. So for example, if you had a freshman as your subject and the cohorts in the room were seniors or juniors, they were more likely, the subject, the freshman was more likely to then say whatever they wanted, whatever they said, they were just going to follow along with them. So we want to be able to recognize a number of biases that we can sometimes see in our offices. So we're going to go over a couple different things. We have ageism. Ageism is, you know, it could be you have a tendency to have negative feelings about someone who's really young, or you might have negative feelings about somebody who's really old. How does that play in our offices? Well, it plays to how do we hire people? Do we look at hiring the person who's maybe older but with more experience, or do we look at hiring the younger person with less experience but they're younger? So it's a give and take. You have to try to figure out where that works out for you. The other place that it works is me, my attitude or my mood for the day. So I went in today, looked at my schedule like I always do. My 3rd patient was a 75-year-old. My 4th patient, I kid you not, was a 99-year-old woman. And my patient after that was a 73-year-old. And I looked at this and I went, damn it, my whole day. This is going to be, it's going to take much longer. So that's that negativity thing going, oh, it's going to take me much longer to do it. It's going to be more problematic. Well, the reality is the 99-year-old is still mobile with a walker. She is completely all there and she's correctable to 20/30. And she really didn't have any trouble deciding which was better or worse. So it really didn't take me any longer. So that's my own bias that made me feel like that. There's the gender bias, tendency to either prefer one gender over another. And again, that comes into, let's say, your hiring processes. Do you tend to hire male versus a female? And again, this might play out in our offices in some way, but as part of the whole world, it plays out a whole lot bigger than that. It also plays into the LGBTQ question, and you know, where there's a lot of people and thinking that, hey, there's only going to be 2 genders, there only can be 2 genders, and they really don't understand the issue behind the pronouns and changing it from, you know, he or she to them or they. And so that is something that we kind of are going to see more and more, and we have to be aware of it, and we have to consciously decide how are we going to deal with it. Name bias. That's a tendency to judge people or prefer people with a certain type of name. In the US, that, or the North America, that tends to be names that are based on Anglo origin. And so a name like Mary or Christopher or what have you tends to have a little bit of a you look at that more positively versus when you look at a name and you can barely pronounce it. Where that comes in is in our offices again. Do we judge those people, or do we look at our schedule and see a name that we don't recognize and go, oh my God, I can't believe this? And how are we dealing with those things? They also showed a name bias in terms of a study where they had people looking at resumes. And in some cases, the resumes had all of the demographics. In the other cases, all of the demographics were taken away. So the name, the age, the gender. And what they did is both resumes were identical, and they were given to a whole bunch of different people that were going to hire. And what they found is when the names were there, the hiring of the person who had the more anglicized name was significantly higher than somebody who had a more ethnic or more uncommon name. On the other hand, when you had somebody, when you've taken away those demographics, then suddenly people are like, oh, you're comparing literally apples to apples, and it was kind of a half and half type of thing. So there really wasn't any difference there. Beauty bias, again, that's a social behavior where we believe that people who are more attractive or beautiful, they're more successful, they're more competent, they're more qualified, they're more lucky, they get more stuff. And again, this is something that we learn from our society, social media, our magazines, TV, and it's different from culture to culture. So what may be beautiful in our culture here may not be seen as beautiful maybe in a different culture. So I have this discussion with my mom a lot of times. My mom grew up in South Asia and still maintains a lot of those biases. And we'll look at something, she go, oh, that person's really attractive. And I'll look at her and I go, no, Mom, no, they're attractive according to those standards, according to our standards, American standards, because I was raised in North America, they're not. And so she and I kind of go back and forth about that. Let's go into racial bias. Now here we're really talking about racism. It's a tendency to have negative feelings about a person based on their race. And that is, we see that with DWB, driving while black. Black drivers are going to get stopped a lot more frequently. You're going to have a lot more criminalization of black people. And the other part of that is that we have a very limited history and statistics on health with respect to Black patients, as well as most minorities, when it comes to healthcare, as well as optometry. Now, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and he said to me, well, I don't think racism really exists. I don't think it's real. I think it's just a made-up construct. And I kind of looked at him and I thought, if you really don't think that there is something like racism or racial bias, where the hell have you been living this whole time? I mean, if you look at that, if you look at racial bias, the attacks against Asian Americans went way up after the rhetoric that was around COVID-19. And then attacks against women who are wearing a hijab or a man wearing a turban went way up after 9/11. So of course we have racism, it's just what are we willing to do about it? Authority bias, that's kind of interesting, because authority bias, when it comes to like our offices, you are the authority. And I don't know about you, but I have this experience at least once a week, if not more. My tech will come to me and go, Dr. Ahmad, this is what I told the patient, which is exactly what I know you're going to tell the patient, but they want to hear it from you. And I'll go in, I'll tell the patient the exact same thing as what my technician had told them, but because me as the authority figure has said it, they're like, oh, okay, I accept that. Another authority figure would be, let's say, the principal in your school or a police officer. So whatever they say or their opinion, you give it more weight, you pay more attention to it. So confirmation bias is different from conformity bias. Conformity bias is the tendency to act similar to the people that are around you, regardless of what your own beliefs are. It's also peer pressure, the bandwagon effect, which you went through. Confirmation bias, on the other hand, it's an inclination to draw conclusions about a situation or a person based on your personal beliefs and prejudices rather than unbiased merit. So why do we do that? Confirmation bias happens because we filter out any information that is inconsistent with our expectations and our assumptions. And so we really only pay attention to what confirms what we already believe or think of. The last one is the horns effect, and that's a tendency to think negative about somebody once you hear something negative about them. So how does that play out in our office? If my tech tells me that, you know, the 12-year-old is acting like a brat out in the waiting area, I'm going to kind of go into the exam room with a little bit of a negative feeling on this child until I get, you know, I can learn a little bit more about them. Or if you see or you hear someone's overweight, you kind of equate that to maybe, are they obese? Are they sloppy? Are they lazy? Are they unhealthy? So you have all of those that come into the horn effect. The opposite of the horn effect is the halo effect, which is, again, my grandbaby. Yeah, you can't tell me anything wrong about her, but if you want to tell me how amazing she is or how gorgeous she is or smart, I will talk to you all day long about that one. So how does this have an impact on medicine or optometry? Well, the reality is that almost every study until recently was always done on men, and it was done on white men. They were the participants, they were the subjects. And so the statistics that we have in medicine and optometry are all based on those tests, and are the way that we treat our patients. Our thought process on what we're going to diagnose and how we're going to treat it are also based on all of those. So it impacts our patient care. So let's look over some of these to kind of see what kind of, to see what impacts we have. So Black and Hispanic patients are significantly less likely than whites to receive pain medication. What kind of bias are we dealing with there? Well, there we're dealing with a racial bias, because those patients, even for something that's really acute, are not getting the same type of pain control as somebody who might be white. I didn't know this until I started this, but patients that are 85 and older have the second highest rate of suicide of any age group other than teenagers. And that was kind of an interesting thing to me. But again, when that happens, physicians are less likely to treat the suicidal ideation in these elderly patients. So what are we looking at there? We're looking at an age bias. And then the last one, women are 3 times less likely to be referred for total knee replacement, even when it's needed, or they're less likely to be diagnosed with COPD than men, even though they have a similar history or similar medical examination. And there we're talking about a gender bias. And so these are all biases that exist in medicine as a whole. So how does that impact optometry? Well, the good news is that even though men outnumber women as practicing doctors of optometry, we are growing. In 2009, only 29% of the practicing doctors of optometry in the US were women. In 2016, that went up to 43. I was trying to find something a little bit more recent. I really wasn't able to, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 50% or over. More women doctors are owning practices in 2016 versus 2009. Here's the negative. According to that 2019 survey, the overall gender wage gap in optometry is still huge. It was up to 47%. So women are still being paid less than men, and the gap is actually wider for women of color compared to white women. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So let's do quick recognizing some of the biases that can be in our practice. So let's define some populations. A lot of times we say Asians, and are we talking about South Asians or East Asians? They're actually very different. So when we talk about East Asians, I'm talking about Japan, China, Vietnam, Korea, Cambodia. I know I'm missing a whole lot, but that's what we're talking about. Now, when we talk about South Asians, I'm talking about Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal. We're talking about those areas. And I'm gonna confess something to you guys. I have a bias against South Asians. When I see their name on my schedule, I already told you, I look at my schedule before the start of the day. If I have a a number of South Asian names on my schedule, my mind automatically goes to, damn it, three things. One, they're going to be late because they are always late. Number two, they're going to ask for a discount. It doesn't matter how poor or how wealthy they are. That's just what they're going to do. They're going to ask for a discount, and they're going to slow me down because since I'm of the same culture, they feel like they can start asking me personal questions like, oh, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What do your parents do? How many kids do you have? Are you married? I mean, ridiculous, but they do that. And so that is my bias right there. Let's talk about African American versus Black. They're not congruous. If you are an African American, you're an American who has a background in Africa, but some African Americans are not Black. Look at your South American, look at your South Africans, look at your Moroccans or your Egyptians. They're actually really, you're not going to see them being as dark skinned. On the other hand, if you are Black, you're not necessarily African. So we kind of have to separate those two things. So for example, if I have somebody who's in my office, they might be from Africa, but they're not African American because they're actually just visiting from Africa maybe. I didn't realize that there was a difference between Hispanics and Latinos. I actually most of the time just interchanged those, but I'd learned that Hispanics actually are the group of people who either speak Spanish or are from a Spanish background. So they could be from Spain, in Europe, they could be from South America, but not all of South America. On the other hand, Latino is anybody who is from South America. So whether they speak Spanish or they speak Portuguese, it doesn't matter if they are from Latin America, if they're from South America, then they are considered Latino. Let's go back to the LGBT question and the gender, transgender pronouns. I had this discussion with a colleague of mine who just absolutely refused to use preferred pronouns, whether it was they or them, or I have a few patients who might be transitioning, transgender, and they prefer one gender over the other. And the argument that he had is that God only made two genders. The reality is that, you know, then I asked him, I said, well, what happens if I say to you, I'm going to call you ma'am from now on, or I'm going to call you Mrs. from now on. He's like, he got really kind of uptight and he said, well, that's not what I am. I'm a sir, or I'm a he. And I said, well, then why do you not have that same feeling when people tell you that they are? So accommodating someone's feelings with virtually no effort, how does that hurt you? How does that disturb you? All you're doing is you're showing respect. I also would encourage all of you to get a little bit of world religions. The 5 most populous world religions are Christianity, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindu, and Jews. So 2.8 million billion Christians in the world, 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, and it's the fastest growing religion, 50 billion Buddhists, 1.1 billion Hindus, and 10 million Jews. Now, here's the thing, is that I'm not saying convert or do an in-depth study, just maybe do the crib notes and find out what are some of the basic beliefs or religions so you can respect it. You can have a conversation with them. Again, words and terminology matter. So for example, if I say this, or like my mom's diabetic, or my mom is a diabetic patient, what I have just done is I've separated the diabetes from her. And so you're trying to separate the disease process from who that person is, because they're not always the exact same thing. So homeless versus unhoused. Homeless, you're almost saying that that person's responsible for not having a house or a home, whereas unhoused makes it sound like there's a lot more going on, which there truly really is. Let's see, white versus ethnic white versus Caucasian. There's differences in all of that. So for example, I come under Caucasian, even though I'm darker skinned, but Caucasian has to do with your features and less to do with your skin color. So, you know, one of the things that I tell a lot of my people, my patients, or sorry, my staff and my colleagues is that Words matter. Two things. One is that if you are that person who a patient walks out and you either make fun of their name or you say something mean about them and you say to your technician, guess what? You have just given your staff permission to now be disrespectful at the same time. And what you see is going to be the tip of the iceberg about what that disrespect is going to be. If you don't tolerate that and you're not, you yourself are showing that you're not being disrespectful, huge difference, because then they're not going to feel like that's acceptable. Again, with words mattering, there's two phrases that I absolutely hate. Number one, I'm not going to be politically correct. And the second phrase is, I just tell it like it is. Both of these, if you really think about it, you are giving yourself permission to disrespect somebody else and to hurt their feelings. And by saying those two things, you're telling them, oh, you shouldn't be upset by it, or you shouldn't be hurt by it. You didn't take the time to consider how you could change your wording to make it more respectful so that you're not hurting someone's feelings. So, you know, being politically correct, it's actually not a bad thing. It means that you're more respectful of people's thoughts and processes. Now, we've talked about these biases. Well, how do you know what these biases are? There's a really good test. It's called the Implicit Association Test, and it was founded in 1998 by 3 scientists, and they wanted to educate the public about bias, and so they provided a virtual laboratory, and you can do this actually at home, which is what I did. And what this test does is it measures the strengths of associations between certain concepts, for example, Black people, gay people, tall people, old people, and evaluations, so good things versus bad things, or stereotypes. And what it uses that cognitive dissonance that we saw with the STROOP test, it uses that to measure it. So what we're looking at is, what do you say versus what do you think versus what do you unconsciously feel? Now, there's at least 15 of these if you go into the website. I actually think there's one based on height, but I don't have it on here, but I'm pretty sure that it's there. And each one is a little bit different. The way that it works is that there's 7 parts to it. They're going to first say, put one finger on the E key, one on the I key. And then they're going to show you positive words and negative words. And every time you see a positive word, you're going to hit the E key. Every time you see negative word, you're going to hit the I key. And they go through that a couple times, and then they switch it, where now the E key is the negative stuff and the I key is the positive stuff. And then they do one test where they're determining, can you tell the difference between features of somebody who is of African American origin versus, you know, somebody who's of European origin. And then what they're trying to do is they're trying to see what subconsciously do you think of these different things. It also, at the end of it, it'll give you a score and it'll tell you what everybody else is thinking and how they're feeling about it. So let's look at this. I did the IAT around Black versus white, and my response was that I had a slight automatic preference for white over Black people. On the right-hand side of the screen, what you're looking at is what 3.3 million other people who took the test, where they showed up. And so you're looking that there's absolutely a bias towards people with more European American features versus people with African American features. Here's the interesting thing. While 70% of white people preferred white people, over 50% of Black people also preferred white people. And so it's not a simple in-group preference. For Blacks, Indigenous, people of color, they actually also show an implicit preference for white people if they've been raised in North America. And it also shows up in South Asians. We see it all the time. Why? Why are we not necessarily preferring our race versus another race? It has to do with the fact that the IAT is reflecting what we have learned from our culture, from our society, from our family, from our education, how we were brought up. So all of that is played into that. One way you can kind of gauge this is, for example, have you ever come to a stop sign and there's like 5 or 6 teenagers and they happen to be Black? What's the first thing we do? We don't even think about it sometimes, and you just make sure that your car is locked. and you just reach over it and very secretly lock it or make sure it's locked. But do you do the exact same thing if you have 5 white teenagers on that same block? You might, but you might not. Do you hold your purse a little bit tighter if somebody, a black gentleman is coming towards you and you're like, okay, I got to hold my purse tighter because I don't know what's going to happen. So those are some of our unconscious biases, and our actions tell us a little bit more than actually the words. I'm going to assume that most of you have seen Squid Game, so this is why I'm going to talk about this one. We all have biases. And Squid Games illustrated the fact that there are biases within a homogeneous group. Now, there was a scene where they had to choose people, but they weren't told what the game was going to be, and they had to choose teammates. And this is the conversation that happened. Well, we already have an elderly man and a woman, so the rest need to be all men. What if they make us play elastics or gongi? Women are better at those. That's true, but probability-wise, men are better at most games. And so the biases that we're seeing is the gender bias, that's the woman versus the man. And in the second quote, it's, hey, women are better at those games compared to men. There's an age bias. Of course, they don't want the elderly man, and they're not realizing that he knows how to beat everybody in that tug of war. Not to mention that he's responsible for all of it, but you're also looking at conformity bias, where they say, yeah, that's true, but let's look at men being better at all races. So it's not really just one little thing. Now, and that's true in different cultures. So for example, in South Asian cultures, if you are taller, if you are skinnier, if you are more if you have lighter skin, if you have lighter color eyes, all of that is considered a lot more attractive. And so people have a positive bias towards that. And if you're the exact opposite, people tend to have a little bit of a negative bias. So we have now, let's say you've all taken the IAT and we've unboxed all our biases. We recognize what they are. Well, what are we going to do about it? I mean, you can't just recognize a bias and then not do anything about it. So the question is, how do I now manage this? Well, there's a couple strategies. One is that don't let explicit biases leak out in the first place. Blind yourself from learning what some of those biases are. So again, going back to the resumes, if you want to really be non-biased on who you're hiring, don't look at the demographics or cover it over and just look at what their experiences and their education is. So that way you're evaluating person based on things that really matter, and you're not going to be swayed by your unconscious biases there. Another strategy is to actually compensate for your preferences. So for example, if you know that you have a preference for younger people, go out of your way and try to be friendlier towards older people. And it's amazing how that works and you're not as uncomfortable with them. In my case, especially when I have an older patient, especially if they're grumpy, I tend to kill them with kindness. I tend to be so overly friendly. By the time they're gone, they think I'm their best friend. And that's just the way that I deal with it. Now, even though this has really not been studied that well outside of the lab, consider how implicit biases form, what we intake, and how can that change. So I would say this could mean that you need to go out of your way to watch a television program or a movie or read a book that portrays women and minorities in an opposite or counter stereotypical way. So for example, the Black guy doesn't always have to be the criminal. The Muslim or Middle Eastern guy doesn't have to be the terrorist. The Hispanic or the Black guy, they don't have to be gang members. So let's talk about how do you do this? It's all about experience and exposure. The more experience you have with certain people, the more exposure you have, the less likely you are to be biased because you have the experience of saying, no, that's not necessarily true. How do you get out of denial? You figure out what your biases are and you admit to them. So think about it. Who's your default? Who do you trust? Who are you afraid of? Who do you feel implicitly connected to or disconnected from? Who do you run away from? Think about those things. And again, the IAT can help you kind of get those out. Try and dissociate the associations that happen automatically in the brain. And that's kind of a weird thing, but move towards your bias instead of away from it. Kind of like what I said about if you have a bias against older people, try and be more friendly, try to get to know them. And the reality is biases are only stories that we tell ourselves about people before we really know who they are. But how are we going to know who they are when we've been told to be afraid of them or avoid them? So I'm saying walk towards your discomfort. Proximity. We know proximity matters. And it's really not about perfection. It's about a connection. In order to connect with a patient, try and find one thing that you might have in common. You won't get comfortable until you get uncomfortable. See something, say something. Children, implicit bias actually begins at a very early age. It can be observed in kids as young as 3 years old. And that's because of repeated reinforcements, repeated stereotypes and such. And so children hear and repeat everything we say. They're at the table. So because I'm aware of this, I've always been very careful to try to make sure that I say what I mean and don't do something different compared to what I say. So our opinions, think about this, our opinions and our beliefs are like bricks in masonry. Each one supports and is supported by the others. If you're going to change a deep-held belief, you have to tear down all the beliefs that are on top of that. And that type of destruction, it's kind of hard to bear. It's easier to live with that skewed wall. And so people are rarely going to let that one brick budge. If they can recognize, or you can recognize your biases and you're willing to be introspective, you can consciously change your unconscious biases. I am Dr. Ahmad. I have biases. These biases affect the way that I think and I interact with my patients and the world as a whole. Our biases, they're a tendency towards or away from something, whether it's a person, place, thing, religion. And if you can recognize your biases around race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, gender, even body image and appearance, we're training our brain that some details just cannot be categorized into a box. So I'm encouraging all of you to kind of explore your biases using some of the recommended tools. I had a slide that has those tools, and I will go back to that in just a second so you can actually take those down. I have one last slide, and this is what I'm going to leave you with. We all know what the golden rule is. The golden rule is treat others the way you want to be treated. But have you ever thought about the platinum rule? The platinum rule is to treat people the way they want to be treated. Thank you. I'm going to go back to that previous slide that gives you some information. So I have a question here. Do you find doctors have these unconscious biases when they're dealing with their patients? Yes, because these biases are built up from our childhood, so we don't even realize it. How do you become aware of this? Well, I kind of knew, but didn't 100% realize that I do have a tendency towards preferring younger patients. So that's where I have now gone out of my way, now that I'm aware of it, to try to be friendlier and more accepting of my older patients. And do you have any resources we can share in our practice regarding biases? So what I've got on the screen right now are some resources. For example, the first one is the implicit association test. So you figure out what your particular biases are. You can look at articles that are about, there's an article about bias and healthcare and how do you recognize those. And there's a TED Talk as well as there's an activity, it's a toolkit. And that might be what you were looking for is the toolkit. It's polkecat.com. Second one, I only have a couple more minutes. Second one is, what do I recommend if as a doctor, I'm the recipient of bias from patients? You are going to get biases from patients, whether they're microaggressions or they're absolute out and out bias. It really, I would say, deal with it professionally. If it's completely overt, you are more than in your right to say, I cannot be your physician, I cannot be your doctor. I actually have had to deal with that a couple times. Like I've had a patient who one time saw my name, saw my picture, and said to my technician, oh, she could speak English well enough for me to even understand her. So she didn't know anything about me. And of course, my tech got a little bit pissed off about that. But so that, I sort of dealt with that. The other bias that I one time had to deal with was a patient who came in to make an appointment and then looked at my name and said, oh, she's Muslim. Well, I don't want to see her, and just turned around and walked away. And my technician was just kind of like, oh, okay, that's perfectly fine. So it's hard to deal with it when it's towards you, but especially in our office, we've got to be professional, even when you do have to get to the point of saying to your patient, I'm sorry, I cannot be your eye care professional anymore. I cannot serve you anymore. I don't see any more questions. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope you guys learned something from it. I'm going to now go to a slide that's going to have my information on it. So that's my email, that's my phone number. If you do have other questions or concerns, just please feel free to reach out and let me know.